This is section 22, where we're actually going to wrap up the discussion on KPIs for global purchasing. First, by talking about KPIs for human capital, the actual people within the purchasing department in our organization, and then move on to the role of purchasing in sales and operations planning. Let's begin. The suite of human capital KPIs for purchasing should include things like the average tenure of purchasing staff. Number one, we need to know how many people are in purchasing. That's pretty much a given. But what is the average tenure of each employee? That says a lot about the overall health of the purchasing department. People want to work there if they've been sticking around for a while. But hopefully, as people's tenure increases, their experience levels and commensurate expertise increases as well. Another KPI, new additions to purchasing, people coming into the department, new hires, transfers from other departments, etc. Two KPIs that we can combine are internal hires, people that came into the department from within the organization, but also external hires. It's always good to have a mix of the two, internal, showing opportunities to people within the company, but external hires as well, to bring a little bit of outside perspective and backgrounds and expertise. On the downside of KPIs, have we had any departmental departures in the period under measure? This month, this quarter, in an entire year? And were those departures voluntary? They left of their own volition, or involuntary? They had a little help on the way out the door. And a great positive KPI to measure, assuming that there are some, are internal promotions within the purchasing department. That's always a good sign of health and growth and opportunity. Some others, before moving on to sales and operations planning, the number of employees in the purchasing department that have industry certifications or achieved an industry certification during the period under measure. Another might be employee involvement with professional associations, outside trade associations related to purchasing or supply chain, or even more general professional associations. That's always good to see and measure. Needless to say, internal training provided and what type of training that's provided in the purchasing department. How many hours of training per employee? Some companies actually set standards for training, 40 hours in a year as an example, and then we can use this KPI to measure against that standard. And then finally, although the amount of money we spend on anything isn't the measure of success, what was the budget or the training spend? In fact, within a purchasing department, as part of the budget, there should be a line item for training, allocated funds for ongoing training, and then at the end of a period, we can measure what was budgeted and what did we spend. Here we have 8, 9, 10 good KPIs for the human capital component within the purchasing department of key performance indicators. We have to measure our own performance and track our progress over time. Last, but certainly not least, in our suite of KPIs is corporate social responsibility. We spoke of CSR and defined it in our module on global sourcing. We're going to bring it to life once again by helping to establish KPIs associated with corporate social responsibility. The suite of corporate social responsibility compliance KPIs for purchasing could very well include the following: any updates in the period under analysis to the importer's corporate social responsibility manual. This KPI obviously assumes that an importer does have a corporate social responsibility manual, or at least chapters on CSR within a standard operating procedure, purchasing agreement, service level agreement, etc. A CSR manual can exist independently or as part of a larger agreement. We want to be able to identify and track any updates to that manual during the period under analysis. One key policy that importers should have in place is that there must be a management structure or an individual person responsible for CSR within the organization. Who is the champion for corporate social responsibility? And if there have been any changes in that management responsibility, we should track that as well. Amounts of internal training for factory labor standards in the purchasing department, in the sourcing department, so our people, as they go out and visit factories, can recognize and measure any type of violations to those labor standards. Total hours of labor-related training. This is related to our previous KPI on internal measures of the purchasing department. This here is specific to corporate social responsibility, but it's the same idea. The total hours of labor-related training. And another good KPI to use external to the organization, last sub-bullet point, is vendors with CSR certifications. One example being the International Standards Organization 26000, which is specific to labor practices. We can actually use this KPI or this standard when investigating new vendors in that sourcing environment, but also as an ongoing practice to see maybe in the course of a quarter, 2 of our vendors achieved ISO 26000 certification. It's a good KPI to have. Moving along, still on this idea of corporate social responsibility, in the period under analysis, how many factories did we audit or did a third party audit? Strong KPI to have there. As a part of that activity, vendors that passed CSR audit and the number that didn't pass. If in a given period we had to issue vendor warnings related to CSR compliance, what was the number of those warnings? And then lastly on this slide, the status of any failure recovery action plans that were already in place prior to the period under analysis. Maybe last quarter we had a vendor that failed a CSR audit. We worked together with that vendor to come up with a failure recovery plan. We have to measure their progress. Another good KPI. 3 more on this slide. The number of vendors aligned with the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. We talked about the Transparency Act in Module 4. We want to reiterate that the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act does not set standards for child labor, slave labor, etc. The CTSCA mandates that qualifying companies publicly state what they're doing to avoid those types of things. They don't set the standards, they make people reveal what importers are doing. That's an important distinction to make here. But we can use the CTSCA to build KPIs. So when we say number of vendors aligned with, we're talking about, does a manual exist for corporate social responsibility? Are audits done? Are those audits done by our own company or by third parties? That's what we're talking about in this particular instance. Others might include, outside of the labor realm, vendor-specific carbon footprint. Really hard to do, especially when dealing with smaller vendors in emerging economies, but something to consider. And continuing along the lines of environmental social responsibility, any vendors with ISO 14000 certification, which like ISO 26000 has to do with child labor and such, 14000 is specific to environmental. Some good KPIs to round out the overall corporate social responsibility discussion. Let's wrap up our conversation on KPIs with a supply chain perspective entitled Metrics for Corporate Social Responsibility. One of the more important KPI categories that a sourcing/purchasing team can use is in the area of corporate social responsibility. In addition to metrics around carbon footprints and a supplier's impact on the environment, CSR must also pay a great deal of attention to human issues that include general labor conditions in factories, forced labor, and child labor. Unfortunately, and due to its very nature, KPIs for corporate social responsibility that measure a vendor's treatment of labor is difficult to measure, track, and act upon. That is not an invitation to ignore or not have KPIs around child labor, forced labor, etc. We are just recognizing the difficulty associated with doing that. Second paragraph. A best practice that U.S. importers can use in the above areas is to adopt those best practices provided by third-party organizations like the United Nations and the International Labor Organization. Additionally, importers can use existing U.S. legislation, such as the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, to build a suite of CSR-specific key performance indicators. We mentioned this a moment ago, but we want to reiterate the point here. The CTSCA does not provide standards for uncovering and mitigating child labor, forced labor, etc. The California Transparency in Supply Chains Act forces importers to publish detailed information on how they go about trying to mitigate and eradicate child labor. With that said, we can use the framework of the Act to build our own suite of KPIs. Do we have a corporate social responsibility manual? Do we do training? Do we do factory audits? If so, are they done by ourselves or by third parties? That's what we're talking about. An example of the above is for importers to build policies around the CTSCA. As you will recall from Module 4 on global sourcing, the CTSCA can be of use when setting important labor-related KPIs like the number of audits of vendor facilities, vendors that failed audits and mitigation protocols, how many vendors certify that raw materials are free of child/forced labor, as well as hours of internal training provided to an importer's employees on these issues. Once again, we can use the framework of the Transparency Act to build our own KPIs. Well, that's it on the multiple sections we had on key performance indicators related to global purchasing. Now we're going to round out the entire conversation, the entire module actually, by discussing the integration of global purchasing with sales and operations planning. We will begin that in the very next section.